that he was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body, he was crucified.
What if the real story behind the Passion of the Christ was nothing like what we saw on screen? What if the film's most shocking truth has been kept quiet by Mel Gibson? Until now. From the outside, it looked like a bold, controversial masterpiece. But behind the scenes, something felt different. Strange moments, unexplainable tension, and a weight that everyone on set remembers. And at the center of it all was Gibson, pushing forward with a project no studio wanted, risking everything for a vision he couldn't ignore. He didn't just want to make this film, he felt compelled to. And now, after years of silence, he's finally revealing why. It all started in the late 1990s. Mel had it all: global fame, box office hits, creative control. But while the world saw success, something inside him was stirring, and what came next would take him into the deepest, darkest, and most sacred journey of his life. Behind the cameras, something was breaking inside Mel Gibson. He was battling demons that no spotlight could hide: addiction, depression, and a deep sense of disconnection. His life, though outwardly successful, was quietly unraveling. He felt lost, hollow at times, dangerously close to the edge. But in the middle of that darkness, something unexpected happened. One day, overwhelmed by it all, he dropped to his knees. No script, no plan, just a raw cry for help. And in that moment, something shifted. He began to return to something he hadn't touched in years: his faith. But this wasn't a gentle rediscovery. It was fierce, urgent, almost obsessive. He started meditating on the Gospels, especially the parts where broken people cried out to God. Words he once read as a child now hit with the force of revelation. And out of that brokenness came a vision, not of a film, but of a story that had to be told. Mel once said, "I was a bad guy, a really horrible guy. My sins were the first to nail him to the cross." That's why he couldn't tell this story like a Hollywood epic. He had to show it as real as it truly was. He threw himself into research, not as a filmmaker, but as a man on a mission. He studied scripture, the Stations of the Cross, writings of saints and mystics. He searched for anything that could help him capture the full weight of Christ's final hours. He didn't want to modernize anything. If Jesus spoke, it would be in Aramaic. The Romans would speak Latin. No English, no shortcuts, no compromises. And that's when the doors started closing. He pitched the idea to studio after studio and got the same answer every time: a brutally realistic film spoken in dead languages with no commercial hook. They told him no one would watch it. They wouldn't fund a single frame. But Mel knew that if he gave in even a little, the soul of the story would be lost. So he did the unthinkable. He funded it himself. $30 million from his own pocket to make the film. Another $15 million for distribution and marketing. No investors, no studio safety net. If the film failed, it would take him down with it. But by then, it wasn't about risk. It wasn't even about reputation. It was a calling, and Mel Gibson was ready to walk through fire to tell the story exactly as he believed it happened. But Mel's next decision surprised everyone even more. He didn't want stars, no celebrities, no familiar faces to distract from the message. In his eyes, this story had to feel ancient, almost outside of time. Viewers shouldn't be watching actors. They needed to feel like they were witnessing Christ himself. That's why he chose Jim Caviezel. At the time, Jim was known for a few serious roles, but he wasn't a household name. What he was, however, was deeply committed to his faith. And that mattered to Mel. Jim had the intensity, the humility, and the quiet strength needed to carry the heaviest role ever written. When Mel offered him the part, Jim said yes, without hesitation. But then something unusual happened. Mel called him back and warned him. He told Jim, "You might never work in this town again." The film was risky, too bold, too raw, too controversial, but Jim didn't flinch. He simply replied, "We all have to carry our crosses." And with that, everything was set in motion. Mel pushed even harder on staying true to the story's roots. He made a daring declaration. The entire movie would be filmed in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew. The actual languages spoken in that era. No English, no modern expressions, no softening things for the audience. What he wanted was complete immersion. While they were shooting, there wouldn't even be subtitles. Those would be added much later. But Mel was convinced that even without understanding the spoken words, people would still feel everything: the betrayal, the agony, the heartbreak. The languages weren't just sounds. They became part of the film's texture. They shaped the atmosphere, the sharp bite of Latin, the haunting tone of Aramaic, making the story feel ancient, remote, and yet painfully real. But that was only the first rule Mel shattered. Where Hollywood might rely on green screens or digital tricks, Mel rejected all of it. He wanted real dirt, real weather, and sunlight that couldn't be manufactured. So he chose Matera, Italy, a stone-hewn city that looked untouched since the 1st century. Its cliffs were harsh, the climate was brutal, and the cold went straight to the bone. But that was exactly what he wanted. On one of those barren hills, the crew built Golgotha. Not a fake set, but a completely constructed crucifixion site. Wooden crosses, rough tools, uneven dirt paths. Everything was real. Everything was rugged. Nothing was plastic or easy. As production drew near, something changed in the air. The actors and crew could feel it. This wasn't just another film. Jim Caviezel later said everyone sensed it. Something was happening that none of them could explain. Something that felt beyond normal. Quiet stories started to circulate about strange moments when the entire set would fall silent, about actors suddenly breaking down in tears, and about an unseen presence that seemed to rest over everyone. It went deeper than simple emotion. As cameras began capturing scenes for the Passion of the Christ, many involved realized they weren't working on a typical set. What had started as a deeply spiritual film had shifted into something almost eerie, something that still leaves those who were there struggling to describe it. And then came the lightning strike. Jim Caviezel already knew the role would demand everything physically. Hours of full-body makeup, carrying the heavy cross, enduring fake whips, bruises, and blood. But no one imagined that even nature would turn against him. While filming a scene on the hill of Golgotha, high on the cross, Jim was struck by lightning. The entire set froze. No one moved. The shock knocked him off balance, and the jolt caused him to bite deeply into his tongue and cheeks. Jim later shared that the damage led to 2 heart surgeries, including open heart surgery, and a long, exhausting recovery filled with medication. What made everything even stranger was what happened next. Only minutes later, lightning struck again, this time hitting assistant director John Michelini, who had already been struck once earlier in filming. 2 strikes in the same place, minutes apart, during the same scene. Scientists could call it a rare weather incident, but for the people on set, it felt like something else entirely. Some believed it was a sign. Others whispered that it might be a warning. And those eerie stories didn't end there. People started quietly talking about a strange presence that clung to the set. Not something visible, but something they could sense, a heaviness in the atmosphere, a feeling that they were being watched. Whether it was awe, fear, or something beyond understanding, almost everyone agreed. This production had entered territory no one could have predicted. As filming moved forward, more unsettling accounts began to emerge. Crew members confessed to feeling dizzy, nauseous, or suddenly overwhelmed with emotion, but only during certain scenes: the scourging, the heavy walk with the cross, the moment of death. It was as though an unseen pressure surrounded them during those moments, and even the toughest professionals felt it. Mel Gibson, usually steady and in control behind the camera, was seen quietly stepping away during those sequences. Some said he went off to pray. Others claimed he was wiping away tears. The weather in Matera, Italy, usually calm, predictable, and dry, suddenly became wild and unstable. Clear skies that should have lasted all day would darken within minutes, only to brighten again as if nothing had happened. A scene might begin under gentle morning sunlight, and then, out of nowhere, fierce winds would slam into the set, knocking over equipment and sending entire tents tumbling across the ground. Dust storms would sweep in without warning, blinding everyone for seconds before disappearing just as fast as they came. After a while, people stopped calling it bad luck. It started to feel like something else entirely, something no one could really explain or name. Then came the physical toll, especially on Jim Caviezel, the actor portraying Jesus. People began to wonder whether he was simply acting the role or being pulled into living it in ways he never expected. During the scourging scene, the whips were carefully planned so they wouldn't touch his skin. But in one take, the angle shifted just slightly, and a metal barb struck him squarely in the back. It ripped his flesh and left a 14-inch scar. Later, while hauling the heavy cross during another scene, Jim slipped and dislocated his shoulder. Many of the screams heard in the final film weren't scripted. They were genuine, raw, and painful. Makeup artists even said there were times when they couldn't tell which bruises they had painted on and which ones had appeared on Jim's body naturally. And during the crucifixion scenes, filmed in bitter cold and pounding storms, Jim developed hypothermia. His body was tested far beyond what anyone expected, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He endured everything from open cuts to overwhelming fatigue, pushed to the limits in nearly every scene. And then there was the detail that made many people pause and think. Jim Caviezel had the same initials as Jesus Christ, JC, and he was 30 years old when filming took place, the same age Jesus was at the crucifixion. Some called it coincidence. Others weren't so sure. Whatever it was, it added yet another strange layer to everything unfolding on set. And Jim wasn't the only one feeling the effects. Several cast members reportedly fell sick during or shortly after intense scenes. Some came down with sudden fevers. Others suffered from sleepless nights or unsettling nightmares. It was as if the weight of the film followed them home long after shooting ended each day. Through all of it, Mel Gibson never publicly claimed anything supernatural was happening on set. But those close to him noticed a shift. He grew quieter, more thoughtful, almost burdened. He started each morning in prayer and was often seen pacing the set early at dawn, quietly murmuring scripture under his breath. Whatever he felt, he kept inside, but the people around him saw it clearly. Something deeper was happening behind the scenes. At a certain point, the set no longer felt like a place where a movie was being made. It began to feel like a battlefield, not between actors and critics, but between something ancient, powerful, and unseen. Something that felt like a struggle between forces of good and forces of evil. For Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ wasn't just a movie. It was a spiritual weapon. What happened during production, he would later say, wasn't just intense, it was unexplainable. When the film finally premiered on February 25, 2004, it didn't arrive quietly. It hit like a detonation. By that point, Hollywood had already turned its back on Mel. Critics were sharpening their knives before the first frame even hit the screen, and religious leaders were preparing either to defend it or denounce it loudly. But no one, not the studios, not the press, not even the churches, was fully prepared for what happened next. This wasn't a typical movie launch. There were no red carpets, no celebrity panels, no appearances on late-night TV. Mel bypassed the entire Hollywood marketing machine. Instead, he turned directly to the church. Evangelical pastors, Catholic priests, and Christian leaders across denominations were given early access. Screenings weren't held in Beverly Hills, but in church basements, fellowship halls, and modest conference rooms across the country. Word spread fast, and from the pulpits, pastors began endorsing the film with a passion of their own. They called it the most powerful portrayal of Christ ever seen on screen. The faith community responded like wildfire. Entire congregations began booking out theaters. Church buses transported members in groups. Some pastors even scheduled sermons to align with the film's release. For many believers, watching The Passion of the Christ wasn't just entertainment. It was a spiritual event. And just like that, Mel Gibson's independent, controversial, and once rejected project turned into one of the most talked-about cultural moments in modern film history. Analysts were stunned. The Passion of the Christ opened on Ash Wednesday with an explosive $23.5 million on its very first day. By the end of its opening weekend, it had pulled in over $83 million, shattering expectations and claiming the biggest February debut in box office history at the time. And it didn't slow down. Despite being an R-rated religious film with subtitles, no major stars, and relentless violence, the crowds kept coming. By the end of its theatrical run, the film had earned around $370 million in the U.S. alone and over $611 million worldwide, becoming the highest-grossing R-rated film in history. At that point, this wasn't just a success. It was a cultural earthquake. A $30 million independent film funded entirely by Mel Gibson had outperformed Hollywood's biggest productions, and the industry didn't know how to respond. But with that kind of success came a flood of criticism. Even before the film was released, controversy was brewing. Several Jewish organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, voiced deep concern over the film's portrayal of Jews in the narrative. They argued that the movie echoed centuries-old accusations that held the Jewish people solely responsible for Jesus' death. Abraham Foxman, then head of the ADL, warned that the film could inflame dormant anti-Semitism in those already predisposed to believe it. Mel Gibson pushed back, insisting the film simply followed the Gospels. He claimed there was no agenda, just a faithful depiction of Scripture. But for many critics, that explanation didn't go far enough. The backlash spread quickly across news outlets, religious forums, opinion columns, and talk shows. The film became a flashpoint in a broader cultural debate. Another major spark for controversy was the sheer level of violence. Critics argued that the film was overwhelmingly savage, relentless in how it portrayed agony. The scourging sequence alone, stretching close to 10 full minutes, was repeatedly highlighted as brutally hard to watch. Some reviewers accused Gibson of elevating the violence to spectacle. Others wondered aloud if the brutality had overshadowed the spiritual message the film meant to convey. Reports from theaters told dramatic stories. Certain viewers fainted, others became sick. Many walked out drenched in tears. Even well-seasoned critics felt shaken. Roger Ebert, who ultimately respected the movie's ambition, admitted, "The film runs 126 minutes, and I would estimate that at least 100 of those minutes, maybe even more, focused directly and graphically on the torture and death of Jesus. This is the most violent movie I have ever witnessed." Still, despite the uproar, the protests, and the constant media attention, audiences continued showing up in massive numbers. Critic David Anson wrote, "Instead of being moved by Christ's suffering or impressed by his sacrifice, I felt attacked by a filmmaker determined to punish his audience for reasons unknown." The criticism was severe, yet Mel Gibson mostly stayed quiet. He allowed the movie to speak in his place. Across the world, the Passion of the Christ stirred just as much intensity. In Mexico, crowds embraced the film with deep emotional devotion. In Italy and Poland, Catholic audiences filled theaters night after night without pause. In Brazil, the movie played everywhere, inside poor communities and inside grand cathedrals. But in France and Germany, where the wounds of historical anti-Semitism still ache, resistance was much stronger. Certain theaters refused to show the film at all. Inside Christian communities, however, the movie took on a life far beyond ordinary cinema. Many believers described it as a divinely inspired masterpiece. Viewers talked about spiritual breakthroughs, emotional restoration, and even moments of physical healing. Churches used the film to spark renewed discussions about Christ's suffering and sacrifice. Evangelists handed out copies as tools for outreach. To countless Christians, this wasn't merely a movie. It was viewed as the most influential evangelistic tool since the Bible itself. But outside religious circles, critics, scholars, and filmmakers saw something completely different. They accused Gibson of using the film to deepen religious tension, to glorify cruelty, and to promote a rigid worldview. Soon, the scrutiny shifted from the film to the filmmaker himself. Journalists began digging into Mel's background. His father's controversial statements denying the Holocaust resurfaced. Mel's own interviews, sometimes defensive, sometimes puzzling, added more fuel to the fire. Suddenly, The Passion of the Christ was no longer simply a film. It had become a cultural fault line, dividing audiences and igniting debates everywhere. When the dust finally began to settle, one fact remained impossible to deny. The movie had transformed the entire film industry. It proved what Hollywood had long overlooked. A massive and dedicated Christian audience was out there, longing for stories that spoke directly to their faith. Studios rushed to respond, producing faith-centered films such as God's Not Dead, Heaven is for Real, and War Room. But none of these releases came close to matching the emotional force or cultural influence of The Passion. It remained the defining standard, the one film everyone tried to emulate but none successfully equaled. Eventually, the headlines quieted. The public arguments cooled down. The theater screens went dark. But for those who lived through the making of The Passion of the Christ, the story didn't end once the credits rolled. In many ways, it had only begun. What happened to the cast, the crew, and even Mel Gibson in the months and years after the film's release was almost as mysterious and intense as the production itself. Some individuals experienced deep spiritual shifts. Others stepped away from the spotlight completely. And some seemed to carry silent, unseen burdens they have never openly discussed. A clear pattern began to appear, one that those closest to the project either couldn't fully explain or simply chose not to speak about. But what might be even more revealing is the ongoing silence. Many of those involved still refuse to discuss what happened. Actors who played minor roles, Roman guards, villagers, have turned down interviews multiple times. Crew members have admitted privately that they simply don't feel comfortable revisiting any of it. Reporters who tried to follow up after production often found themselves hitting dead ends, stopped by a strange and consistent barrier of quiet. There isn't any scandal hiding behind it, and no secret being covered up. Just a deep silence. Those who do speak describe the atmosphere as spiritually overwhelming, something that went far beyond what anyone would expect from an ordinary production. And for those who remain quiet, some believe it's because the experience felt sacred, and they don't want to disturb that sacredness. Others suspect they encountered things they can't explain, things they still struggle to put into words. And then there are whispers that what happened during the Passion reached beyond filmmaking, beyond narrative, that it stepped into something spiritual, perhaps even supernatural, and that everyone involved sensed it. Because for those who were there, the Passion of the Christ was never just a movie. It drew a clear line in their lives, a definitive before and after. Jim Caviezel paid for it with his career. Mel Gibson paid for it with his reputation. And countless others left the set changed, humbled, burdened, or healed. Yet very few regret being part of it. They witnessed something, they felt something, and they understand that whatever took place during that production cannot be captured in a behind-the-scenes special or fully expressed in an interview. It was personal. It was sacred. And in a subtle, quiet way, it might still be unfolding, even now. Maybe that's why the silence endures. Because the Passion of the Christ wasn't only about the story of Jesus. For the people who made it, it became their own cross to carry. But what about you? Do you think the Passion of the Christ was just a movie, or was it something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next one on the screen. The journey goes far beyond what you expect.